The world of My Hero Academia is filled with countless quirks, but I'm sure there's one in specific that I'm pretty sure most of us can agree was done absolutely no justice, and that's Tetsu's quirk, which gives him the ability to turn his body into steel, which when I was watching I was just like, okay, I guess that's kind of cool, but is that it? That's all he could do with steel? So that got me thinking, what if I was to give Deku a quirk like that, but not only give him Tetsu's abilities, but also give him a bit more? And that's when it hit me. Just give Deku Gajio's Dragon Slayer magic, or turn it into a quirk at least. So with all that out of the way, ladies and gentlemen, don't forget to leave a like on the video. Shout out to this person right here for commissioning this, and with no further ado, enjoy. Get up, Izuku, and don't try to snitch on us again. It's bad enough you're the family's weakest link, and now you're gonna go off snitching on us whenever we do something to you? You're so pathetic, Deku. Are you sure you're even part of the family? Yeah, Izuku, what are you doing? Why did you think that it was such a good idea to snitch on Big Bro? You know he wasn't just gonna let that go, so why even bring it up with Mom? Shut up! What do you know? He broke my toy. Of course I was gonna get mad. And you know, what was I gonna do about it other than tell Mom? Well, look at how that turned out, Izuku. I didn't even mean to break the damn toy, and now I'm grounded for 2 days, all thanks to you. What do you guys say I teach him a lesson? He would crack his knuckles as looking at his siblings, he would smile. Oh, and in case you haven't noticed, Deku in this timeline has a bunch of siblings who all have iron, metal, whatever the heck you want to call it, quirks, steel, whatever you want to call it. Point is, they would go down and begin to punch Izuku, and the second his fist would make contact with Deku, you would hear a loud thunk type noise as the boy's fist would recoil backwards and he would go, ah, what the heck? As Deku, currently wincing, closing his eyes, would be wondering why he didn't feel the attack, when suddenly, Deku looking at his hands, he could see that his skin was covered in metal. Deku would think, it finally happened. I got my quirk. In this moment, his big brother would growl as he would say, so, looks like you're part of the Iron family as well. How's about I give you a warm welcome? As his hand, which his only quirk is essentially to turn his arm into like an iron blade, that's all he could do, would swing his arm at Deku's direction knowing that a normal punch wasn't gonna do anything. In that moment, Deku's siblings would go, wait, you're gonna kill him! But before they could stop it, the blade would clash with Deku's skin as we would hear the sound of iron clinking against iron. The sound would be loud and Deku would simply be standing there having been completely unfazed. In this moment, everyone seeing that would say, Deku, are you? As Izuku would be standing there with nothing but a slight scratch. Looking at his older brother, he would say, you can't hurt me anymore. Yeah, you're right. You can't hurt me anymore. So why don't you just get lost, Gajeel? I don't have to take anything from you anymore now that I've got my quirk too. His older brother, cracking his knuckles, would just say, whatever, you damn brat. As he would walk off and Deku would just be standing there. His other siblings would go over to him going, whoa, that's so cool. You were able to take a full-on attack from Big Bro. At this point, Deku would have a huge smile on his face as his siblings would get up close to him, and funny enough, they would all have a version of the quirk that Deku's gonna be having. His older brother could turn his arms into blades, which were made out of iron. The brother, which was currently telling him how cool his quirk was, had the ability to essentially eat iron in order to gain more energy. Another had the ability to warp metal around them and just bend it into different shapes at a very, very low scale. So don't think Magneto, it's nothing like that. And the final one had the ability to actually turn his entire body into iron, similar to what Tetsu could do. So in case you haven't noticed, Deku is kind of going to be having a combination of all of his siblings' quirks, having been practically the Todoroki of the family, the perfected version. And this is going to be absolutely perfect for Deku's family, because this is just what the doctor ordered. Deku in this timeline had not been born to Inko Midori or Hiyashi. This time, he had actually been born into an extremely impoverished family with a rock star dad, or at least a failed musician dad, who always was trying to get new gigs in order to try to keep his family afloat, who was in possession of a quirk that pretty much allowed him to harden his fists, making them as hard as iron. His fists were the only only things that could transform, which is why he never ended up pursuing some sort of hero career. And as for Izuku's mother, she actually had the ability to transform certain things into silver. They couldn't be living objects, but the only downside to the quirk that she actually had was the fact that eventually she would have definitely tried to use this quirk to sell this silver. But unfortunately for her, once people ended up finding out that that wasn't the real thing, she, well, got into some bad things and bad people came after her. So she ended up having to leave and wasn't able to become a hero. She ended up becoming a criminal and, well, she's kind of been on the run ever since with her boyfriend that she met, which in her own words was just some loser musician. That said, this is what would have led to the birth of Izuku and his 4 or 5 siblings, all of them having some strange spin-off of his own quirk, with them all getting stronger or some being weaker than others. Deku obviously having the strongest of all the quirks, but with that being the case, Deku having awakened this would end up discovering that not only could his entire body turn into iron, or steel or whatever it was, but Deku seemed to have a variation of everyone's quirk. Well, except his mother and sisters, who also had the ability to touch to turn whatever she touches into iron. That said, once Deku would go on to display these incredible abilities, his parents would start to change their tunes towards him. His father pretty much ending up deciding that he's gonna pour everything that they have into Izuku, and the family essentially deciding that either Izuku becomes a hero and somehow saves the family from poverty, or they're kind of screwed. Considering that they were a family of, like, what was it, 6 people I ended up saying, or 7, that pretty much sometimes have to go days without meals. Luckily though for Izuku and his brother, they actually had the innate ability to eat iron, so their bill kind of had to be taken off the menu, considering the fact that their mother and father could always just go to the junkyard, finding them some scrap pieces of metal, iron, or steel, whatever you want to call it. But regardless of that, with this being the case, Deku would actually grow up and become stronger and stronger. Having been surrounded by his siblings all his life and Deku being a really late bloomer, having awakened his quirk at the age of 7 years old, Deku would have already been a rowdy, rambunctious kid, a lot more similar to Bakugo in nature, and kind of having a little bit of that Gajeel persona in him. Safe to say, Deku growing up with his family would definitely have that, and I quote, dog in him. So by the time that Deku would hit the schools, Deku would carry himself with this I'm the best mentality, knowing that at the end of the day, he does have an incredibly powerful quirk. And by this age, Deku would already have a very, very fine tunage with his quirk, considering that he could pretty much just copy his siblings when it came to how they utilize their quirks. All except obviously his sister and mother who could eat, or no, sorry, not eat, but transform living things, or sorry, non-living things into iron. Deku, however, would have actually ended up discovering that not only does he have those crazy abilities that they have, but after years of training and doing combat training with the siblings who would constantly help Deku to get stronger, the family being super thrifty and all kind of putting their hopes into Deku would start changing the family dynamic, with even though Deku being the youngest of all of these siblings, Deku would be treated as though he was the king in the family, always pampered by his parents, with his siblings always being nice to him, knowing that if Deku does end up making it in the big leagues as a hero, they were going to be having someone they can rely on to say, hey Deku, you think I can have some money? Or hey Deku, you think I can get me this house? Or hey Deku, can I get this car? It's kind of that really, sick, yo, little bro, take care of me type mentality. But overall, there would still be some days where Deku might cross the line a little bit and some of his siblings might try to fight him. Obviously, they know that they can't do anything, so whenever these skirmishes would happen as a kid, Deku would just kind of stand there tanking whatever damage they can try to inflict on him and just laugh. But that said, as the years would pass, Deku would just get stronger and stronger, with Deku looking up to multiple heroes and actually trying to find some different fighting styles for himself. When it comes to the techniques that Deku would have developed for himself over this time, Deku would have actually developed a couple, with one of them being Iron Dragon's Club, where instead of turning his hand into a blade, Deku could actually turn it into a steel club, extending it to hit people at long range and causing a lot of damage, because just imagine a fat arm that turns into a steel club just coming at you super quickly and just slamming into you. That does a lot of damage. He also has an ability called Iron Dragon's Lance, which essentially allows him to turn his arm into like a lance type object and use it like a whip. He can do sweeping attacks, or using that, he could actually shoot small little spear-like projectiles out of his hand, which are just little pieces of steel that are kind of like little shards that are shot at you and could embed into your skin like they were bullets. Also, having the ability to create a sword of steel that can actually work similarly to a chainsaw, with the ends of it spinning in order for him to use it as a cutting attack, which is really sick. And last of all, he actually has an ability that he's named the Iron Dragon Roar. He ended up taking this move from what Endeavor can do with his flames, shooting flames from his hands. Deku had developed his own Iron Lance technique, which he can shoot those little shards from, but seeing that Endeavor was able to shoot so much fire powder out of different spots in his body, Deku, idolizing the hero, would have ended up playing around with his quirk one day and discovering that he could actually shoot out those crazy iron shards from his body that come out in a breath attack that at the moment was kind of weak, but after years of training this ability, Deku finally would have made it strong enough to be considered a pro hero's attack. So with that being the case, and Deku being as strong as he was, we would get to one of the days when Deku was on his way to school with him in backpack in tow. He'd be walking there as a couple of friends would be behind him, some common thugs, you know, with some really decent quirks. Deku would end up hearing police sirens from the distance. As Deku, hearing this, would have a cocky smirk on his face. Deku would smile, thinking to himself that it's about time he made his hero debut, saying this out loud. His friends overhearing this would say, "Whoa, dude, you're not planning to..." As Deku, having a smile on his face, would turn to them saying, "What? Planning to use my quirk? Of course I'm not stupid enough to show it off in public. That's why I'm gonna do it from here." He would begin to climb up a building to the highest point, as he would end up seeing this gigantic monster similar to the one that we see in episode 1 of My Hero, as Deku, breathing in, would go, "Iron Dragon Roar!" and a massive amount of iron scale-like little shards would go shooting towards the direction of this gigantic villain, who, seeing this beam coming at him from a distance, would cover his face with his hand, ultimately shuddering in fear, as Deku, with a smile on his face, would say, "Guess that should have taken care of them." He would see the dude fall down onto the ground, crushing some buildings, as Deku, seeing this, having a smile on his face, would say, "Serves the bastard right. Maybe next time he'll think twice before using his quirk out in broad daylight." His two friends hearing this would say, "You know, dude, you did just do that." As Deku, turning to his two henchmen, would say, "Shut up, now let's go to school." Grabbing his things, he would end up making his way there, with nobody finding out that Deku had actually been responsible for taking that villain out, with people only having seen little gusts of iron and wind flying at the direction of whatever that was and taking it out. So, with that being the case, Deku making his way into his classroom, he would walk inside, and some of the kids that he bullies, because yeah, Deku definitely is going to be a bit of a bully in this timeline, would kind of wince. Deku, walking over to one, would say, "Hey, you done the homework yet?" And the kid would say, "Yeah, it's right here." Deku takes it from his hand and says, "Thanks. Guess today I won't have to clobber ya." His hand turning back into a normal fist instead of a club, as he would sit down at his desk and, grabbing a toothpick, would start to pick some iron out of his teeth. That said, Deku would wait for the teacher to walk inside of the classroom, and when he does, the teacher would say, "So, it appears that you guys are finally going to graduate in a couple of months. Well, I think it's about high time we start thinking about what you're going to do in the futures. Every other school in the district is currently handing these out, but what's the point? I know you all want to become heroes anyways." He throws the papers up into the air, as Deku, having a cocky smile on his face, would say, "Damn right we do, but if we're being honest, I'm the only one with a chance to become a pro hero, and once I do, I'll be even richer than All Might. Just watch me." As everybody looking at him would kind of just have to admit that it is kind of true. Though Izuku might be a bit of a jerk, they can admit that one day he's definitely going to be making for a formidable hero. The teacher, hearing this, would say, "Oh, Izuku, yeah, well, honestly, I can't argue with that. With your quirk, you probably are going to be making for an incredible hero." As after this happens, we would end up hearing the bell ring, class would begin, and then we hear the final bell of the day. With that happening, Deku would grab his things and make his way home, starting starting to do his very own 10-month training time skip. During this time, Deku would pretty much end up just training on his own quirk, allowing his siblings to actually just attack him, making his durability grow even more powerful. Also spending a majority of his time at the gym and a junkyard, where Deku's free to go train as well as eat all the iron and steel that he wants, powering himself up and shooting massive scale attacks. That's what Deku's been doing for the longest. When it comes to his physical training though, Deku does have a buddy who works at a gym, so pretty much just giving him a couple of bucks every month, maybe 5 or 6, his buddy would always sneak him in, so you could always kind of just see Deku near the bench press, just cranking out some sets of 405 on bench. Deku doing this would start swiping off some sweat off of his face as a crowd of gym goers wrapping around him would say, "Damn kid, you're pretty impressive. You thinking of becoming a pro?" Deku looking at them would say, "What's it look like? Beat it. The lot of you can just get out of my way, because I'm busy over here training to become a hero." Them all hearing this would smile, saying, "Good luck, kid," as Izuku, looking towards one of the girls that was nearby, would say, "Wait, not you. You can stay here." From here, Izuku would actually tell her to get on top of one of the sides of the barbell, as putting her on it, he would continue lifting the weight with a smile on his face, having become more of like a womanizer type character, seeing as, he had a bunch of scumbag brothers who weren't exactly nice to the ladies, a dad who gave him a horrific example of what it's like to be a dude in a relationship, and, if I'm speaking bluntly, a skank of a mother. So with that said, Deku has all the makings to just pretty much be a jerk in this timeline. But I digress. Eventually, with Deku's character breakdown and past all out of the way, we can now start to focus on the events of actual MHA, as we would start everything off with the entrance exam. We would zoom into an old crappy car making its way towards UA, shooting out a bunch of fumes into the air, as you would just start hearing inside of the car, "Move, let me out!" A bunch of arguing and tussling would be happening in the car, as Izuku's mother would say, "Hey, the lot of you, shut up already!" She would say, "Now let Izuku get past," as Deku finally having to stop struggling to get out of his own car, would finally make his way out, and everybody would start waving towards him, saying, "Hey, you better make us proud in there, you hear us? Or else we'll clobber you, As Deku hearing that would say, yeah, whatever. Now can I go inside and become a hero already so we can stop living this crappy lifestyle?" Everybody would start to be like, yeah, go for it. As Izuku's dad would end up saying, "Remember son, do your best out there. We're all counting on ya." As they would peel off, and Deku standing at the entrance of UA would go, "Guess that crappy family of mine is depending on me after all. Gotta make them proud in there." As he would look towards the school thinking, "Damn, this building's big," he would end up walking inside, and doing so, he would be greeted to a written test. As Deku seeing this test would think, "Ugh, crap. Guess I should have studied instead of making a bunch of extras actually do my work for me. Guess this is gonna bite me in the ass. Better hope I do well enough on the practical exam or else the school's sure to boot me." He would go on to answer questions at random, luckily with them being multiple choice, and by the end of everything, Deku would end up getting a score of 59%. But since the answers that he ended up actually getting right were all kind of random, UA system's definitely going to be able to detect the fact that Deku just kind of got lucky, if you could even call 59% lucky, seeing as they're all graded on Japan's scale, which means that 75% would have actually barely been passing, so 59, not so much. That said, eventually Deku would find himself outside getting ready for the practical exam, as Deku would have this little headband on, this cool little rock star outfit on, and he would even have a really cool fairy tale emblem tatted on his right shoulder. Deku in this moment, looking towards the directions of the gate, would be so excited, waiting for the test to start, as Deku, realizing that he's kind of bored, would go on to take a piece of metal out of his pants, as he would start munching on it with people staring at it being like, "What a weirdo, he's eating the iron." Deku in this moment would say, "Huh? Got something on my face or something?" as he'd be chewing with his mouth open, and people would say, No, we're sorry about that." Deku would say, "You better be sorry," as he would end up making his way towards the front, beginning to walk towards the direction of a shy girl with brown hair. Obviously, this would be Araka, but as Deku's making his way there, we would see Ida stopping Deku as he would hold his hand on his shoulder and say, "Hey, you better not be trying to interrupt that girl. Everybody's here trying to concentrate and she doesn't need..." You talking to me, small fry? Let me give you a piece of advice." He would wrap his arm around Ida, telling him, "If you don't get away from me in 5 seconds, I'm gonna bash in your head so hard they're gonna be calling me a villain." as Deku letting Ida go would make his way towards the front, with Ida thinking, this hooligan, how was he allowed to make his way into UA? With Deku walking to the front thinking, if there's gonna be nothing but stuck-ups like him at the school, I don't know if I even want to go here. As he would laugh going, who am I kidding? Where else am I gonna go? This is the best school after all. As Deku would finish thinking this, you would suddenly hear Present Mike over the intercom saying, go, go, go! There isn't any countdowns and any real battles. As all too suddenly, you would see everybody rushing to the directions of the robots. But Deku with a smile would think, finally! His eyes glowing red as he would rush towards the direction of the villains, with him rushing at the direction of a three-pointer. All too quickly, Deku would say, Iron Dragon's Club! As he would send his arm crashing into the three-pointer, blowing it up, then rushing to the direction of more robots as Deku would start using different attacks on each robot. Iron Dragon's Lance, you would hear, as a multitude of robots would end up being taken down. Suddenly, Deku would turn his attentions towards a one-pointer, shooting a multitude of small shards of pieces of iron at it, causing it to blow up in an instant. After this happens, Deku would say, Iron Dragon Sword! As creating a chainsaw-like blade on his arm, he would extend it as he would begin going right through multitude of robots. Suddenly, Deku would have ended up racking up 172 robot points in that time, with him eventually hearing the sounds of a gigantic robot. Deku, hearing this, knowing he didn't have to, would munch on some more iron, as in an instant Deku would say, Iron Dragon's Roar! Shooting a massive attack at the direction of the zero-pointer as it would destroy it before it could even get close to Uraraka. This would lead Deku to racking up another 70 rescue points thanks to him helping Uraraka, who unknowingly he had saved. After this, he would continue racking up even more points, getting a grand total of 200 something robot points, with everybody watching the exam being completely stunned, thinking, this kid, he just took everything down, with Principal Nezu smiling, thinking, well, it seems that this year's candidates are going to be very talented. Mr. Aizawa, would you mind bringing him here for a second? As this would happen, Mr. Aizawa would look at Nezu as he would say, sure. As Aizawa would begin making his way towards where Deku's examination spot is at, and once everything would finally be over, Aizawa would signal Deku to come towards him. Deku would do so saying, so how'd I do? With Aizawa staring at Deku blankly saying, the principal wants to have a word with you. Deku hearing that would say, damn! Didn't think I did that good, as he would follow Aizawa closely behind, eventually finding himself in a room with Nezu. Nezu at this point would go on to pretty much sit Izuku down, telling him that while he did incredibly well during the physical section of the exam, he did want to talk to him about the written portion. He would go on to ask Deku to tell him the truth. Has he ever studied before? And Deku, looking down at the ground, patting the back of his head, would say, well, not precisely. Nezu would say, I was afraid of that. Well, I cannot deny the fact that you possess incredible skills when it comes to performing heroic activities. However, we can't be having somebody who can't pass UA's education standard. So I propose this, Izuku. You will be admitted into UA, however, you're going to be asked to participate in an extra hour of school every day. Izuku hearing this would have his expression fade from his face as he would look down in agony, thinking, no way. In this moment, Nezu would say, well, do you accept? As he would go on to add that he really would like Izuku to go to their school, saying that in addition to all this, he was also going to be providing Izuku with a full-ride scholarship to the school, saying that it's the least that he can do for him. Izuku hearing that would say, wait, are you serious? With Izuku realizing that that loan that he would have taken out to pay for UA schooling wasn't going to be having to be necessary anymore, and instead, the family could actually use it for groceries or maybe some home improvement. Deku hearing that would go, you got a deal, you damn mouse. As he would look towards the direction of Nezu shaking his hand, and Aizawa would go, looks like we've got to work on his manners. After this would take place, Deku would end up waving goodbye to Nezu and go home, giving the family the good news. At the dinner table, you would just hear, what? As Deku, eating an old dusty rim, would end up looking towards the direction of his mom, going, yep, the school ended up admitting me with a scholarship. Guess I'm even better than I gave myself credit for. As Izuku's siblings hearing that would say, that's great, what are we gonna do with that scholarship money, huh? With Izuku saying, that's easy. I'm gonna buy myself a bike so I can get to and from school, and the rest of you, well, you guys could do whatever you want with the money, throwing a big bag of cash that he was supposed to be using to give to UA once the school year started, that they would have taken out from a loan in the bank, would end up pretty much saying that this is their big ticket out. Once these 3 years are over, they're gonna be living like kings, if not before that. Deku would go on to have a big smile on his face as his entire family would say, "We're counting on you, little bro." And Izuku would then say, "Oh, and one more thing." Suddenly, you would hear a knock at the door as it would say, "Hey, I'm the pizza delivery guy." Deku would open the door saying, "Got us a bite." As everybody would be like, "Yeah!" It had been literally like 2 years since the last time they had pizza, and the only kind that they could afford was always that cheap stuff. So, with Deku having gotten them pizza from a really nice place, they all dug in, and by the end of it, all 5 of the boxes were completely empty, with Deku having been given the last slice by his siblings, something that's never happened before considering that they would always dang near fight to the death for it. Deku would be like, "Wow, you guys are really gonna give it to me like that?" With them all saying, "Come on, Deku, we all know that you're the pride and joy of this family." Well, at least ever since you awakened your quirk. Before that, you were pretty pathetic. Deku would throw an iron club at his brother's face, smashing it into him, as he would knock him out and Deku would say, "Shut up, Gajil." He would then pretty much end up looking towards the direction of his siblings saying, "Anybody else?" And they would just all stay quiet. Deku's mom suddenly would rush at him, hugging him so close that Deku would say, "Mom, get my face out of your..." And she would say, "I'm sorry, Zuko, I'm just so happy." And Deku, turning towards his dad, would say, "Well, old man, you got anything to say?" His dad would look at him and go, "Shooby-doo-bah." In case any of you guys actually get that reference, please comment it down below. But anyways, with that being the case, Deku would finally end up making his way towards school the very next day, where Deku would begin his first day of classes and would undergo the quirk apprehension test. Oh, and also since he does have to stay after school, he's gonna be doing that. Alright, guess it's time to find out who's gonna be in my classroom. Deku would take a couple of steps in, and the first thing he would be greeted to would be Bakugo and Ida arguing. Deku, seeing this, would have a smile on his face thinking, just like home. He would make his way towards his seat knowing that he's not exactly going to try to cause a scene for this school, seeing as they were generous enough to give him a scholarship and admit him to the school without having actually passed the test. So, Deku would sit down at his seat and would start fidgeting with the UA outfit that he has to wear. He would think, "This thing's so uncomfortable." When all of a sudden, some of the people in Class 1A would start murmuring about who that was, with some saying that he's the student rumored to have gotten a score even better than All Might's. People would start muttering about that, saying, "What? There's no way." And this would finally catch Bakugo's attention. "So it looks like you're the little celebrity I've been hearing so much about. The kid who ended up getting more points than All Might himself? You don't look so tough to me." Deku, looking at Bakugo, would smile, going, "Hell's that supposed to mean, you spiked up Pomeranian?" As Bakugo, looking at Deku, would say, "What the heck you just say to me?" blowing explosions in his hand. Deku, seeing his quirk, would think, "That's cute." But before this could escalate any further, Aizawa would end up coming out of his sleeping bag and deactivating Bakugo's quirk. Unfortunately, not able to deactivate Izuku's because his falls into the mutation category. So he would simply wrap a scarf around Deku, telling him that he doesn't exactly feel like expelling him on the first day. That said, he would sit back down and be like, yeah, whatever. As after this, Aizawa would go on to tell them to throw these on and meet him outside. The class would quickly do so, and then we would get the first couple of events of the quirk apprehension test. Deku would have a ball thrown at him, as Aizawa would go on to explain that he needs him to throw it as far as he can. So Deku would do just that, tossing the ball with his arm as hard as he possibly could, shocking everybody at the strength that Deku had shown off. Aizawa, showing the score, would end up pretty much noting this was only about 20 points higher than his actual score that he would have gotten in middle school. Deku would say that his physical strength has always been insane thanks to his quirk, and he's not exactly able to turn that off. So, Aizawa, hearing this, would nod, and everybody else would go. Deku would do incredibly well during the grip string test, getting an impressive score. For the standing long jump, Deku would clear it using the iron club. For the repeated side-to-side steps, Deku would extend and extend his arm over and over and over again, pushing himself from side to side. And then we would have the ball throw, which he would do once more, seeing as the first time was just a demonstration. On Deku's second attempt, what Deku would end up doing this time, knowing that he had to get the longest amount, not necessarily just throw it with his arm, would end up tossing it up into the air and timing an Iron Dragon roar perfectly, sending that thing flying further than his first score and actually beating out Bakugo's score by just a couple of points. He would then turn towards him, smiling at him, seeing as Bakugo would have done so the second he got a better score. So, with that being the case, Deku looking at Bakugo and doing this would piss him off and would say, "You wanna go?" As he would lunge at Deku, but before he could even make contact with him, Aizawa would stop him with a scarf, with Bakugo going, "The hell? What's this?" And Deku seeing this would smile, saying, "So, you're the eraser hero, Eraserhead." He would have a smile on his face knowing that he's going to be having a pretty good teacher to work under. And so the final 3 tests would happen: push-ups, sit-ups, and maybe toe touches. With that said, we would then end up getting the final rest of the students go up next, and then the day would finally be over. With that said, Aizawa would tell Izuku to report to this classroom for the after-school program. And so Deku would grab his things, making his way there, as he would be like, where is this place? As he's making his way there, he would run into a girl who looks a bit older than him with blue hair. Deku looking at her would literally proceed to call her babe, as he's all like, "Can you come over here real quick?" And so she's all like, "Sure." And she's like, "So why you call me babe though?" Deku would just say that that's what he calls all the cute girls. And after she hears that, she would just be like, "Oh, thank you." Obviously it's Nejire with her bubbly personality. She wouldn't even really mind this, as Deku just kind of looking at her would ask her if he knows, or she knows, sorry, where this classroom's at. She would look at him and say, "Oh yeah, that's right over there." And she would walk him there and be like, "So what's your quirk?" Deku would say, "My quirk allows me to turn my body into iron." And she would see this and say, "Whoa, that's impressive." Deku would say, "You ain't seen the half of it," as he would then smile, and her hearing this would say that she hopes that she could see him again. Deku looking at Nejire would say that he might need her help once again getting around the school. He would ask for her number, and Nejire, being none the wiser, would be like, "Okay, sure." This dude would end up getting Nejire's phone number because she had no idea that he was trying to actually get it for, trying to get at her purposes. But regardless, he would end up getting the phone number and typing her name in, as Izuku would smile, putting her in as babe with a red heart emoji at the end, as he would scroll down his comment section and realize that he needs to change the heart color. He would turn this one to a blue heart, as there would be one with a red heart, one with a pink heart, one with a green heart, one with a blue heart. I think you get the point. Deku has a lot of babes, if you get what I'm saying. But regardless, after this would happen, eventually we would get the day of the 2v2 battles in. And when this happens, safe to say this event is going to be a bit of a movie. So we would begin. All Might would come in through the door, and Deku, having massive respect for All Might, would definitely, be out of character for a moment, be like, "All Might," being stunned that he's here. As eventually we would get all the students being shown their hero costumes, with Deku repping the iconic Gajio outfit. Everyone seeing that his hero costume kind of just made him look like a punk rocker would be like, "Whoa dude, that's kind of a strange hero costume." Deku though would point out that Jiro has almost the same aesthetic going on for her. And Jiro seeing this would ask if he's a rock star or something like that, or he has that kind of quirk. Deku looking towards her would go on to say, "Nah, he's really just wearing this clothes because this is just his style." He would go on to say that it kind of rubbed off on him, seeing as his pops was, a failed musician. Him saying this out loud without any repercussions would have everyone looking at him like, "Why are you saying that about your dad?" But Deku, would kind of just shoulder shrug and be like, "All right, well, All Might, what are we doing?" All Might would go on to explain that today, they're going to be taking part in 2v2 organized battles. So everybody would begin drawing lots, and ultimately we would get Deku and Ochako versus Bakugo and Ida. The second that this event would start, Deku, knowing that he gets his first chance to beat in that little Pomeranian, would have a huge grin on his face, knowing that not only does he get to establish himself as the top dog instantly, but he has an excuse to clobber that little cocky bastard. So getting all those things together, he would make his way inside, telling Uraraka to just stay behind him. She would do exactly that, walking behind him, with Deku making some snark comment about how, he's not going to let a single hair on her pretty little body be hurt. As they're walking inside, Deku would then have an explosion thrown at him, as Deku would stand there with this huge grin on his face. Bakugo would say, "How was that, huh?" As Deku's standing there having tanked the blow, him pretty much just eating a bit of iron before he gets serious, would look at Bakugo before asking, "If that's the best you got, then you might as well run away with your tail between your legs, cause I'm gonna kill ya." As Bakugo looking at Deku would be like, what the? And all too quickly, Deku would say, Iron Dragon Club! As a massive club attack would go rushing at Bakugo, hitting him square in the chest, sending him crashing into a wall. Bakugo in this moment would end up grabbing onto Deku's arm and trying to like bend it or like move it. But Deku would say, what? You think you're strong enough to move my arm? Bakugo in this moment would blow an explosion at it, using the force behind it to get Deku to get some distance between them, as Bakugo looking at Deku's direction would think that he's a lot tougher than he looks. From here, Bakugo would smile, rushing back in at Deku with an unorthodox attack, causing Deku's sword slash that he was about to try to land on Bakugo to miss, as Bakugo would blow an explosion at the back of Deku's head. All this would manage to do would pretty much be causing Deku's head to go forward a little bit, as Deku turning back around would see a full-on massive explosion that Bakugo would generate square in Deku's face. Deku taking the blow immediately would look at Bakugo as the explosion would create a bunch of debris and dust, as Deku walking closer to Bakugo would say, is that all you got? And Bakugo, hearing the fact that Deku might as well have been completely uninjured, would actually feel a bit of fear, considering the fact that in this moment they were in close quarters combat and he could estimate that Deku was definitely a brawler. So all too suddenly, these random shards of iron would start being flung in his direction and Bakugo would start to get injured. Blood would begin pouring down his body as Bakugo would finally end up taking all the blows with a smile on Deku's face, as Bakugo would go on to say, go to hell. He would pull the pin and a massive explosion would fill the corridor. Deku, being hit by this explosion head on, would have his entire body turned to iron in this moment, as Deku's clothes would have been torn to shreds by the explosion, but Deku would have stood there having no damage at all. Deku looking at Bakugo would say, guess it's my turn, as he would say, Iron Dragon Roar! And shoot a massive attack at the direction of Bakugo. Bakugo in this moment would be flung to the other side of the corridor as he would be knocked unconscious, and Deku would tell Uraraka, you can come out now. Uraraka hearing this would say, whoa, you beat him that badly? As Deku would say that he tried to kill him, so he just returned a favor. He would then start hearing All Might telling him that that was completely uncalled for, as Deku would say that he did it first, he was just evening up the scores. All Might hearing this would kind of agree at the fact that Deku kinda did have a right to do it, but he would still tell him one more of those and their whole thing will stop. Deku hearing that would tell him okay, telling him that at least he didn't kill the kid. As after this, Deku would end up making his way towards Ida's room, where he ultimately rushes towards Ida as fast as possible using his insane speed stat, as he would then throw an Iron Dragon Club at his direction, hitting Ida square in the face, knocking him out, bruising him, and knocking out some teeth, as Deku would have a huge grin on his face, saying, All Might, was that uncalled for? All Might, knowing that Deku definitely did that on purpose and that was not heroic at all, would end up telling him that that was a bit excessive, as you know, he'd be a little annoyed at how far Deku likes to take things. But Deku definitely remembered what Ida did during the entrance exam and he was just paying him back. So shortly after this, he would tell her Araka to get the bomb. She would run towards it saying, okay, as jumping on it, Izuku would smile saying that she looks pretty up there. As Uraraka jumping down from the bomb would start blushing and be like, oh no, you don't mean that, but Deku looking at her would smile as he says he definitely does. Uraraka in this moment having like a little bit of a blush moment because someone pretty much just called her cute or whatever. I can definitely see her maybe reacting like that to anybody but Mineta. Like, I really do think that if Kaminari or Kirishima said that to her, she'd start blushing like crazy. But if Mineta was to have been the one that did it, there's just no way that that reaction's happening. Anyways, with that being the case, the USJ arc would then be up next, and after about, say a week, the students would all be given permission slips and told what they're going to be doing next, as they would all go home and their parents would sign off on this. Deku in particular, making his way towards his mom, would give her a paper. She, not really caring, would pretty much grab the lipstick she was currently putting some on with and begin signing on the paper. Deku looking at his mom would think, she'll never change, will she? As looking towards the direction of his sister, who now was starting to look more and more like her mom every day, would think, damn it, as he pretty much thinks to himself that either he makes it as his hero stuff or his family's screwed. That said, we would then end up getting a scene of everybody on the school bus making their way to the USJ, And as everybody else would be talking about things, we would have Deku wearing some headphones, listening to some rock music, as Deku would be listening to some softcore rock. None of that like heavy metal stuff. Deku jam into this stuff, singing along, would be like, shooby-doo-bah, as he's just in the back seat, just vibing. And right next to him would be Jiro. Her hearing Deku's music because of her earphone jack would say, oh, are you listening to da-da-da-da? As Deku, taking his headphones off, looking at Jiro, would say, I am actually. Her noticing this would end up asking, how long he's been listening to that. As at this point, we would actually get like a full solid 15-minute conversation of Izuku and Jiro just talking about rock and music and how like certain music is trashed nowadays and how this is real stuff or whatever. But regardless, after this little interaction would happen, Deku would have his opinions on Jiro change a little bit. Before, he thought she was like just like a random little ugly girl, but now the fact that she likes this kind of music, he thinks, maybe her meter might have shot up to a solid 7. With that out of the way though, we would finally get the students right in the center of the USJ, as the pro heroes would be stunned to see Kurogiri appear in the center. He would say, I'm sorry to crash the party, heroes, but it appears we weren't invited. Instantly, Deku, seeing this, jumping into action, would use his Iron Dragon Club, as his hand would extend with a massive club hitting to the direction of Kurogiri, but ultimately going right through him. In this moment, as Deku would reel his arm back, a portal would appear right next to Izuku, which he would fall right inside and find himself inside of water. Deku in this moment would proceed to hold his breath, just going as he's holding it as long as possible, and as Deku would open his eyes, he would see a crowd of villains beginning to rush at his direction, one swimming at him at full speed. Deku, seeing this, would smile under the water with his mouth closed, as he would throw an Iron Dragon Club at it, hitting him in the stomach, knocking him out, proceeding to hit 4 villains that were behind him. Suddenly, Deku would create a lance, as he would proceed to start beating these villains inside of the water, as you would see some parts of the water actually turn red, with these villains' bloods actually causing the water to start changing color. Almost like if you were to pour a little bit of food dye into some water, it slightly changes a little bit. That's what Deku did. There is definitely blood in the water at this moment. However, as Deku would be landing the final attack on one more member, about to run out of oxygen, suddenly Deku would feel a tongue wrap around his torso, as it would be none other than Tsuyu who would have been the one responsible for saving him. She would drag Izuku onto the boat, and Deku, turning towards her, would say, "Don't you ever touch me with that disgusting tongue again." As Tsuyu, looking at him, would be like, "But I saved you." And she kind of just stays quiet. That said, he would then look towards them, telling them to let the real heroes handle this, using his club to extend it so far that Deku made his way to the land, using it similar to a extension pole to like leap over those big things. Like, that sport that people use like a big pole and they like leap over these little like high things. I don't know what the heck the sport's called, but you guys know what I'm saying. Regardless, Deku, making his way towards land, seeing that Aizawa was currently facing off against a horde of villains, would jump into action by quickly using his iron slaying lance. He would shoot a ton of miniature little pieces of iron at the villains, with this causing some weaker villains to be taken out. Deku suddenly would be rushed by an enhancer type Quirk, who's a really big fat dude, and Deku, seeing this, would think to himself, if he could eat this, he would throw a massive club attack towards his direction, and instantly the dude's stomach caves in, as he would be sent flying, and the dude starts literally rolling on the ground. That said, Deku, then turning towards the direction of who he believes to be the main villain, Shigaraki, would have a cocky grin on his face, to which all of a sudden Shigaraki would say, "Look behind you, hero." Deku, turning around, would see the Nomu reeling its arm back as it would throw a punch square at the face of Deku's jaw. This punch would connect and would actually cause Deku to slide on the ground a couple of meters away. Deku, feeling this, as smoke would come off of his face, would say, "I actually kind of felt that one." As Shigaraki, watching this, would be like, "What? The Nomu's punch had no effect? His quirk is iron, but even still, the Nomu's as strong as All Might." Him seeing this would watch as Deku would smile, going, "I hope you can take a punch as well as you can deliver it." As he would shoot an Iron Dragon hammer at its direction, his arm having turned into a hammer-like weapon, as it would crash into the Nomu, who, being pushed back slightly, would actually tank the attack fully. Deku seeing this would think, interesting, so you're a durability type. As Shigaraki would begin gloating, going, the Nomu here was created to beat All Might himself, so if you believe that you're going to be damaging the Nomu who has shock absorption, well, think again, brat. Deku hearing that would say, shock absorption, eh? Guess that means regular punches won't work on this thing. But you know, it's not like that's all I could do. Suddenly, a gigantic blade would be formed in Deku's arm as little spikes would start spinning on it, making it look more and more like a chainsaw. As Deku, smiling at the direction of the Nomu, would say, I'm about to send you back to hell. He would then rush towards its direction, slashing at the Nomu's arm, cutting it clean off of its body. The Nomu's arm would then start to regenerate, growing back into place, with Deku thinking, that's freaky. As he would then slash at the Nomu once more, the Nomu would use its hand to try to dodge Deku's attack, as it would then jump towards the direction of Deku, trying to land a punch, but Deku, tanking all the blows of the Nomu, would think, so, it's durable with its arms, legs, and even torso. It can regenerate all of those things. But I wonder, Deku at this point would raise his arm up as the Nomu would punch him square in his stomach, trying to move him, but it wouldn't work, considering that in this moment, Deku was using his most durable form, making his iron turn into that of scales, making it so that it's even more impenetrable, looking as though it was some sort of dragon scale. With that said, Deku, raising his hand into the sky, would then drop it on the Nomu's brain as he would start cutting into it like a chainsaw as little bits and pieces of the Nomu would fall to the ground, and as we all know, once you eliminate the Nomu's head, well, it can start to die a little easier. So, with that being the case, Deku would then turn his attentions towards Shigaraki, would say, so, that was your whole plan? Waltzing in here with a half-dead bird brain creature? This organization is so lame, man. That thing couldn't even defeat me, and you expect it to defeat someone like All Might? He would have a cackle in his voice, as turning towards Shigaraki, he would say, oh, but don't think that I'm like the rest of these heroes. I'm not gonna let you off the hook. As in this moment, two things would happen. One, Bakugo arriving to the scene would speed blitz the direction of Kurogiri, catching him off guard, who currently was focusing on the battle between Deku and the Nomu, and having defeated him, Deku turning his attentions towards Shigaraki about to attack him, Kurogiri was gonna use his Warp Gate quirk to try to stop Deku's attack, but all too suddenly, Bakugo would come flying at him, holding him onto the ground, telling him, if you move a muscle, I'm gonna blow you up so bad, they'll be cleaning you for weeks. As, Kurogiri, unable to help Shigaraki in this moment, would watch as Shigaraki would begin taking step backs, going, what? No, this isn't fair. This wasn't how this was. As Deku would say, Iron Dragon Roar! A massive attack of iron would be sent towards the direction of Shigaraki, who would be absolutely cooked by this attack. This thing would practically put him in a near-death state, with Shigaraki on the ground completely unconscious, having tons of shards of iron embedded into his skin, with Deku having a smile on his face. Aizawa seeing this would go to Deku, telling him that he took things too far, but Deku, looking at Aizawa, would say, so what? I was supposed to just let this damn villain attack our school and not let him know not to do it again? He's lucky I let him live in the first place. But Aizawa, looking at Deku, would say that's not how heroes do things, with Deku turning towards him as he would say, how do you do things? What, did you want me to let the Nomu beat your brains out? Or did you forget that that thing had strength even with you helping me with your quirk? Don't forget that if it wasn't for me being here, you'd probably be dead, so a little gratitude would go a long way. Besides, dude's not dead, but he is a couple of inches away from it. As he would laugh and walk away, it'd be in this moment that Deku, going towards Bakugo, who was currently restraining Kurogiri, would say, come on, Explosion Boy, what are you waiting for? You need me to tell you how to live up to your name? Bakugo, looking at the direction of Deku, would hear him tell him that these guys had the nerve to bust into UA and try to kill the lot of them. He would look at Bakugo, as Bakugo, hearing this, would say, you know what? You're right, we should return the favor. And as he would be about to blow Kurogiri up, sending him scattering all over the place, All Might blitzing in would stop this from happening, with Deku, watching All Might moving, being stunned at the speed that he could display. As Deku, seeing this, turning to All Might, would say, what's the big idea, All Might? You on the villain side now or something? Why did you stop Bakugo's attack? All Might turning towards Deku would tell him that that's not how heroes do things, as Deku would say how were they supposed to do things, give him an opportunity to teleport himself and his little friend here away? I think not, All Might, and just like I said to Eraserhead, these villains deserve death. They attacked students at their own school, probably were responsible for the school break-in over there at UA, and even tried to kill you. That thing that I fought was supposedly strong enough to take you on, and you know what, All Might? I think it definitely could have given you a run for your money. All Might hearing this, however, turning to Deku with a serious expression would say, young man, we'll talk about this later, as he would pretty much tell Izuku and the rest of them to catch up with their classmates. Deku would do just that, and it'd be at this moment that Aizawa walking by Izuku would tell him not to step out of line, reminding him that just because he has a scholarship to the school doesn't mean that it can't be revoked. Deku hearing this would think, whatever, as he would then make his way towards his class, and after this would happen, we would get, what, a 2-3 day break, with the students all essentially being told that they're going to be taking a few days off of classes considering what just took place. So, over the course of this time, Deku would have more than enough time to train, as eventually the students would all be told about the UA Sports Festival, and Deku hearing about this, knowing that this is going to be his opportunity to make it in the big leagues and get his name out there, he would be more than excited, knowing that once he wins this thing, he's going to be in the big leagues. So, Deku preparing for this thing would suddenly get an email telling him that he's actually going to be the one giving the speech. So Deku seeing this thing would end up pretty much thinking to himself that when it comes to this speech, he's just going to tell everyone the truth. So in much like Bakugo-like fashion, Deku making his way towards the direction of the microphone would simply say, I just want to tell everyone that I'm gonna win this whole freaking thing. As everybody hearing this would be like, what? He doesn't have UA spirit? Everybody would start getting mad at Deku, much like they would have to Bakugo, and Bakugo seeing what Deku did would be like, those are some pretty big words for somebody that still hasn't won anything. Better hope you can live up to that claim or else you're gonna be looking quite foolish. He would look at Deku and smirk, as Deku turning to Bakugo would grin, telling him that he's ready for all his weak ass attacks. That said, the race event would be announced, and Deku, looking to the direction of all the stands, seeing all these people and heroes, would think to himself that this is his chance. Finally, his family is going to be out of poverty, and Deku, knowing that his family was definitely watching this from their crappy TV, would think to himself that this is going to be a great opportunity to show them just how far he's come. So, during the first event, Deku would take full advantage of his quirk by using his Iron Dragon's club to leap out of there. Once that was done, Deku would be among some of the front runners, coming face to face with one of the 0-pointers, as he and Todoroki, both seeing them, would launch full-scale attacks. Deku, with a breath, would end up using this Iron Dragon roar, blowing it to bits, with Todoroki freezing 2 of them and them continuing to run forth. Bakugo seeing this, and in third place, would actually begin to use his explosion quirk to catch up, as Deku, realizing that him not being a speed type brawler is definitely going to be impacting him for sure. But ultimately, Deku would just put his head down and continue running, knowing that whether he wins this event or not doesn't really matter. So, at the end of everything, Deku would end up being the one to land third place, and with that all being said, we would then jump into the cavalry battles, which we're gonna be skipping. However, I do want to take note of one thing. Deku, seeing that Monoma could copy other people's quirks, would actually egg Monoma on to try to copy his own, and Monoma, being the D1 class A hater that he is, would obviously take this chance and copy Deku's quirk. With him seeing that he could do that, Deku, in this moment, having the amount of points that he needs to pass anyways, would actually start helping Monoma to get past this event, and would rush to the direction of Shinso, taking all of his team's points, meaning Ojiro, Shinso, even some of Class 1B's students. After doing so, Deku would end up pretty much handing them to Monoma, telling him not to fail him, as Deku had a plan, and he was planning to let Monoma copy his quirk for a big fight, saying that if there was ever going to be someone who could actually pose a threat to him, it was going to be himself. But since he couldn't exactly fight that, he was going to be fighting the next best thing: his copy. Deku in this moment would step in the ring, turning to Monoma saying, hey, come over here and use your quirk on me already. Monoma would say, what? You're really intending to let me use your own power against you? Class 1A truly is stupid. Well, I'm gonna show you just how strong your quirk could be in the right hands. Deku would say, shut up already. As he extending his arm covered in iron, he would let him touch it. With him having copied Tetsu's quirk prior to this, thinking that that would have been a pretty good counter to this, but he was not ready for what was about to happen. Because the second that the event would start, Deku would start everything off with an Iron Dragon Club, which Monoma, quickly copying, would launch the same exact attack. Both clubs would connect, however Monoma's would actually shatter. In an instant, Monoma would realize the true difference between their abilities. Deku mastered this. He was just a cheap imitation. After the first hit would land, Deku would say, what's wrong? Don't seem so confident now, do ya? As he would then turn towards the direction of Monoma, telling him to launch one of these attacks. Turning his hand into a blade, he would rush at Monoma, who, knowing that he could do the same thing, would try as well. However, it was in this moment that Deku would start spinning the blade in his hand as he would slash it the direction of Monoma, cutting into him. The iron itself would chip off into the air as Deku, eating the iron that would have, the little iron sparks and shards that would have shot out from him, would actually eat them, gaining even more strength. People seeing this would say, what? He can eat iron, as Present Mike would go on to explain, Izuku Midoriya, or Izuku something something something, has a quirk that allows him to turn his body into metal, create metal weapons, and even shoot it out from his mouth. Pretty gnarly if you ask me. As the crowd would go wild, and he would say, but guess what? That's not it. He also has the ability to eat metal like shards and increase his strength over time. Isn't that awesome? Everybody would start going nuts, and Deku in this moment would start clobbering Monoma, showing off different aspects of his quirk on somebody who he knew was going to be able to tank that and more. And finally, after using Monoma as a display and actually having some fun landing attacks that normally he wouldn't be able to use on other people, thanks to the fact that, you know, people are made out of flesh and bone, not metal like he is, would actually have a lot of entertainment. So once the battle would be over, Deku would actually tell Monoma he wasn't half weak, as he would kick him off of the stage, with Monoma being unconscious and some of the people watching going, whoa, that kid's brutal. But with Deku being the winner, he would simply raise his hand into the air as he would say, that's what's up next for whoever's facing off against me. As he would walk off the stand, and some people would say that he might have taken things too far. However, others were thinking that that was awesome. The display of combat that they just saw between Monoma and Deku was sick. It was exhilarating. And as Izuku's siblings would be watching Izuku fight from the screen, his older brother would say, not so weak after all, huh, Deku? As he would then pretty much be having a smile on his face, thinking that his brother was going to be achieving all the dreams that they all wished they could have had. It'd be at this point that Deku would then be matched up against Todoroki for a second match, and the second it would start, Deku, knowing that Todoroki was going to start everything off with a massive ice attack, would do exactly the same thing. As the second that Midnight would say, well, are you guys ready? And the crowd would start getting hyped up, Deku would instantly start preparing his first attack. Breathing in a massive amount of air, as the second that Midnight would say, begin! Izuku would start everything off with an Iron Dragon's Roar, one of his most powerful ones, as Todoroki's ice would be completely destroyed via the breath attack that Deku would shoot at him, and Todoroki would be sent flying off of the arena, completely unconscious via one attack. Deku standing there victorious, telling everybody that there wasn't a single damn student at UA who could match him in terms of strength. So, with him being taken out, Deku's final opponent would now be Bakugo, since Ito would still end up resigning due to his brother getting injured. The battle would begin, with Bakugo rushing to Deku's direction and once again trying an unorthodox attack that he would have used when they fought last. However, Deku, having expected this, would actually drop to the ground before extending his leg out like a club and kicking Bakugo. This would actually nick his face as it would scratch him up a bit, and Bakugo, redirecting himself, spinning in the air 3 times, would blast an explosion at Deku using a far-ranged attack that he had developed. However, this attack would do nothing to Deku, with him saying, you know, if you're expecting to defeat me like you beat that Kirishima kid, don't bother. We're in completely different leagues, me and him, and while his runs out of juice, mine doesn't. I could have this active for 24 hours if I wanted to, so you could try for days and days to crack me, but I promise, those weak attacks won't even put a dent in me. he would reel his arm back, creating a club hammer as he would throw it at the direction of Bakugo, who, being hit with this attack square in his stomach, flying in the air thinking that he was completely out of range, would be stunned by the new and improved range of Izuku's attacks. This would cause Bakugo to begin falling out of the air as Deku, turning both of his fists into little iron clubs, would start shooting a gum-like attack like the pistol, or no, not the pistol, but the Gatling, as he would begin punching Bakugo in the air over and over and over and over. This would ultimately leave Bakugo unconscious as he would hit the ground with a loud thunk, and everybody seeing the final match would think, whoa, he has that kind of firepower up his sleeve. But with Deku being the winner, President Mike would start going nuts, basically making a scene and commotion, being like, Izuku Midoriya's the winner! As everybody seeing this would be like, whoa, they're just in different leagues. After this happens, we would get the medal celebration happening as all the students would finally return back to class after this event, and we would have all the students begin to pick their hero names as well as their internship opportunities. And when it comes to what Deku's decisions are going to be for that, I could easily see Deku picking the iron hero Metallica. And not for the reason you might be thinking. Not for the band, but actually as a homage to the dragon who actually taught Naruto, or sorry, not Naruto, but Gajeel dragon slaying magic, Metallicana. So, with that said, this would only leave one more decision for Deku to make. Who's he gonna internship with? And I'd like to think that the person who he would obviously go with would be Mirko, a fiery hero who has a personality that could perfectly complement him, who could teach him not only how to fight a little bit more and help him out in terms of his offensive capabilities, but also show him around what it's like to be a hero and maybe even be responsible for helping Deku to tame himself out a bit, not to be as an aggressive of a character, considering that Mirko would have had to learn that the hard way. So that's what Deku's internship would consist of, and due to the fact that Deku wasn't going to be going with Gran Torino in this timeline, I don't know if Ida would even survive the stain encounter. Much like in most of the what ifs that I've been doing lately, with the exception of the Maharaga one, I can actually see Ida dying to Stain because of his quest for revenge. And so, Class 1A's rep would actually end up dying in this timeline, with most of the students being impacted by this greatly. One of them not really caring about it as much or trying to act as though that didn't even affect him slightly would be Deku, who thinks he did annoy me, but deep down, Deku had to admit he was gonna be missing his class rep yelling at him to do certain things and being, well, that really strange person that he never could quite put a finger on, but at the end of the day, it was his class rep and was a classmate that was supposed to graduate by his side. Deku, realizing that yeah, heroes die, but they weren't supposed to die when they were training, would get pissed. This would lead Izuku to make it his mission to defeat Stain, but obviously having been given the internship opportunity, or sorry, scholarship by UA, I don't really see Deku going out of his way to try to attack the hero killer, considering that that could put his little scholarship in jeopardy thanks to what had happened during the events of the USJ. So with that being the case, everybody would kind of return back to school once their internships would be over, Deku having learned all the things that I had explained previously, and everybody going back to class with a weird air around everything. People would try to act like everything was okay, but that elephant of the room, which was Ida's death, would just be lingering, not really allowing anybody to really have a good time. So this would have a huge impact for the story going forward, or at least for about a week. That said, as I was seeing that his students clearly were shaken up about this, would end up pretty much taking them on a bit of a field trip to all give homage and honor Ida. They would visit his grave, where all of them would go on to say a few words, and after some heartfelt goodbyes, the class would finally be ready to continue with their hero, academia. After the students would start to get over the Ida situation, the teachers would finally slowly start telling the students that they're going to be needing to take their final exams soon, to which at this point, most of the students would start freaking out about how they're even going to pass, with one of them primarily being Izuku. Now, sure, he had been going to after-school programs every single day since he's been at UA, but regardless of that, Deku just wasn't the book-smart type of person, so he was extremely struggling with his education. That is, until all the students started talking about making their way to Momo's house for a bit of a study session. In this timeline, Deku would be part of those people, and he'd be there being tutored by Momo herself. After everything would be said and done, let's give Deku a respectable 70% passing grade. That's what Deku's gonna get. Barely passing. But now that the written exam was finally done, Deku now had to take on one of the teachers. And now that I'm looking at the lineup, he could take on Cementos, freaking Ectoplasm, Power Loader, and the rest, because I don't exactly want to name them all. I think that for this specific timeline, the best person for Deku to go up against, funny enough, would actually be Cementos, since he's able to use his quirk in order to pretty much keep his distance from Izuku. However, unfortunately for him, the second that the test would begin, Deku would start everything off alongside Kirishima, telling him that they're going to start things off nice and easy. He would go on to tell Kirishima to use his quirk to try to smash through these walls, but eventually after not being able to get through to Cementos with them just coming back over and over, Deku would get so tired of this, ultimately opting to just Iron Dragon Roar! Shooting a massive attack at the direction of Cementos' walls that he would have created, as they would shatter straight through and nearly actually impact him. Deku, realizing that he would have shattered a multitude of them, would say, "Kirishima, come on!" And as they would get closer and closer to Cementos, he would just create more cement walls and actually just get more distance. This process would repeat over and over until eventually Deku would be a grand total of 6 Iron Dragon Roars in and still hadn't gotten to Cementos. This ultimately would end up pissing the dude off, as Deku, using his iron club, would shoot it at the ground, extending his arm extremely high, as Deku mid-air would breathe in once more, using his Iron Dragon Roar, sending it flying at the direction of Cementos. He would try to hold up a barrier to stop the attack, but it would just blow right through it, actually hitting the teacher and completely hospitalizing him. Now obviously the reason that Deku hadn't done that prior to that was due to the fact that he didn't exactly feel like killing his teacher. But after he ended up evading him for that long, Deku got as pissed as a normal person would get with the fly in your room. Like, have you guys ever had that experience where you're really trying to kill an insect in your room and it just keeps like evading you? It's even worse when it's a mosquito and you're about to sleep and you just know that it's gonna suck your blood, and like you're scared because you might wake up with a new little pimple thanks to the mosquito on your face that not only is there, but it's also itchy. So yeah, Deku was not exactly having a good time and just blew up Cementos. So with that being said, the final exam section would be over. Then we would get all the students making their way to the mall, with Deku tagging along, not really to buy anything, because mind you, he was still broke, but Deku would have been there. But you know who wouldn't have? Shigaraki, because the dude was currently in Tartarus, and with that being the case, All For One would have ultimately decided that Shigaraki may not have been a worthy enough successor if he was defeated by some UA student who wasn't even All Might's successor. So I can actually see a world in which I'm doing something that I haven't done in a lot of what ifs, which is making All For One create ties with Sei Hisaki, which is essentially just overhaul, right? He ends up pretty much creating a close bond with him and opting to give him his power and influence in exchange for, his goals, which is essentially to create Quirk destroying bullets, which All For One thinks is perfect. The best way to defeat All Might would be to render him as powerless as a normal civilian, and that way, he was able to completely destroy the one person in his way. Maybe even using these Quirk destroying bullets to impact Izuku, but we'll get to that point when we get to that point. That said, the forest training camp arc would happen, and unlike in the original, I can actually see all the students going through this arc and not having to deal with the villains, considering that the whole Vanguard Action Strike Squad was compiled by Shigaraki. So no Shigaraki means that there's none of that. Not to mention the fact that because Stain never ends up going viral, we never end up getting characters like Magma, Spinner, Dabi, Toga to join the League of Villains. Instead, a potential new arc would actually I'm not entirely sure how I want to go about this, but it could potentially be overhaul a squad of misfit villains attacking the students, and this would actually make for a really interesting scenario. But the only unfortunate part is that I don't exactly remember who they are. The only one that I'm positive I could maybe end up making a really cool fight out of would probably be Kendo Rappa, so replacing Muscular would be him, and I could probably cover that fight for you guys. So the only knowledge that I have of that character, truth be told, is the One's Justice game, because currently I'm rewatching the overhaul arc with my girlfriend, and we're still barely on the part where Sun Eater is facing off against those 3 random thugs that he ends up fighting once they get to the actual raid part of the arc. And since all I know about Kendo Rappa is that little section of the One's Justice 2 game, the power set that he has, I'm gonna just be going with that. So the battle would commence, and Izuku, noting that there's this massive hunk of a villain in front of him, not hunk as in like good looking, but like that might not have been the best word choice for me right there. This giant of a villain would actually throw a punch at Deku. However, Deku eating that thing would ask him when he was gonna start fighting seriously, to which Kendo Rappa, coating his fist in red aura, would throw one more blow at the direction of Deku, who, feeling this, would smile as he goes on to throw his very own hit at him, throwing a club attack which would actually send him back a bit. He would then wipe off the attack, shrugging it off as he would rush back towards Deku's direction, opting to try to knock him onto the ground and then proceed to beat him down there, just throwing punch after punch after punch. But Deku wouldn't allow that to happen, and the moment that he would get close enough, Deku would create two swords on each arm as he would go to slash at Kendo Rappa and instantly dig into his torso with two blades. That said, Kendo Rappa would actually grab onto Deku's head and begin trying to smash it in using all the strength possible. But as this attack would be about to land on Deku and his fist would or his hands would cover Deku's head, Deku would start digging deeper into Kendo Rappa's body as he would ultimately stab so far into him that Kendo Rappa would fall unconscious due to blood loss. That said, Deku would have a huge smile on his face knowing that he was no match for him, and he would go on to help out the rest of the students with whatever villains they had to take on, eventually running into a squad of 3 villains, with one who was pretty much rushing at Deku and, funny enough, actually ended up eating his iron. Deku, jumping out of the way, would end up actually extending his club arm to try to hit at the direction of the crystal villain, shattering a percentage of it as its parts would begin flying off, and Deku, then creating some distance and seeing that all 3 of them were just so persistent, would grow so tired of this. He would ultimately simply opt to use an iron roar and send the 3 of them flying away. With that attack landing, Deku would then tell them to stay in their own lane, as he would then go on to find the rest of his Class 1A students and Class 1B counterparts and help them out with taking out whatever other members are left. Eventually, we would get a scene where Deku, being side by side of Tetsu, would both end up taking out some random villain who ended up merging with the ground and started making it wobble or whatever. That said, the 2 of them together would easily be able to take the villain out, and finally, the true villain of the entire attack would make his face known: Overhaul. He would go on to tell Izuku that he's been looking for him. He was ordered by All For One to take him in, and that was all the orders he was given. So, Overhaul, placing his hand on the ground, would proceed to use his quirk on it, shooting spikes at Deku, which Deku, standing there with a smirk, would go on to tank. He would ask him if that was it, but Overhaul, closing the distance between the 2, removing his glove, would tell him no, not quite. And as he was about to create contact with Deku, Deku in an instant would have his instincts start screaming at him, don't let him make contact. So Deku at the last second would dodge Overhaul's attack and then proceed to create a blade with his other hand, knowing that this guy is dangerous, and slash at Overhaul. So Overhaul would have a gash attack straight through one of his sides, as Overhaul, placing his hand on it, would have his hand covered in blood. However, the next second that Deku would look at Overhaul, he would see that the injury itself had completely disappeared, thanks to Overhaul having used Ares' reverse quirk, or time manipulation, or what was it? Rewind. Yeah, rewind. Thanks to him working with All For One, Ares' quirk would have been given to Overhaul in order to be used as a quirk to essentially regenerate himself. So using rewind on himself, thanks to him understanding the quirk a bit more than Ares, because he's a full-grown adult and did countless experiments with the thing, would be a perfect matchup for Izuku. Somebody who, even though isn't technically immortal, has the ability to rewind his body and ultimately leave Deku with the choice. Does he kill him or does he not? But if we're being honest here, Deku's gonna be trying to kill him, realizing that this is a villain that clearly attacked the school and is literally not gonna go down unless Deku manages to land some killing blow or possibly knocks him out, would end up opting to just decide to lead him into a perfect scenario. This is when he would go on to look towards the direction of the 2 students next to him, Bakugo and Todoroki, and tell them to help him out. He would tell Todoroki to encase them in a small area so Overhaul couldn't get get away, and all of a sudden, a massive dome of ice would be created. Then, turning to Bakugo, he would say, "Hey Bakugo," but he would say, I know," blasting off to overhaul and using a howitzer impact. That, however, would have been a diversion, and would have given Izuku just enough time to, before overhaul could make contact with Bakugo, disintegrating him, or technically overhauling the kid, Deku would use his most powerful Dragon Slayer roar. This would end up destroying a massive section of the forest, but ultimately with it would end up disappearing overhaul. He would completely die thanks to this attack, and Izuku, seeing this happen, would have a huge grin on his face thinking, that villain's finally dead. As almost instantly, a black portal would appear, and out from it would come none other than All For One. In an instant, he would actually use his black tendrils to grab a hold of Deku, who, seeing this happen, would try to use his strength to break out of it, but noticing that he couldn't, would then be flung straight into a couple of trees, as Deku, getting back up, would say, "What? Was that supposed to hurt?" As All For One in an instant would use his quirks to blow an explosion at the direction of Bakugo and Todoroki, with Deku watching the attack in awe, being like, "How in the world is that multiple quirks?" Him not knowing of the concept of one for all or all for one would be completely stunned, not knowing what to do, as turning towards the direction of All For One, he would ask why the hell he's here. All For One in this moment would simply clap, telling him that he's been interested in his abilities for quite some time, and he had been meaning to take them. As hearing this, Deku would say, "Good luck with that. There's no such thing as taking quirks." But instantly, All For One, using a wind quirk, something that he still hadn't displayed, would say, "Oh, isn't there?" All of the air in the direction that Deku was standing in would instantly start being sapped out. The oxygen would stop working in that spot, and as Deku would try to breathe, there would be nothing, no oxygen for Deku to pull forth. He would be stunned, looking at the direction of All For One, who would go on to pretty much harden the air around him, which would cause Deku to be inside of a prison, similar to what mimes act like they're inside of, an invisible wall. Deku, however, having access to his strength, would reel his arm back, however, lacking oxygen, would only be able to punch a bit weaker than normal. So, throwing his fist, he would break the barrier that All For One would create, escaping, catching his air, as all too quickly, All For One, shooting 3 tendrils at Deku's direction, would wrap them around his arm and around his throat, and it would begin squeezing as hard as possible. Deku, however, would luckily use his hardening quirk to be able to avoid most of the damage, with him turning to All For One, asking him what exactly these puny attacks are going to do to him. Sure, they might have injured his classmates, but him, he's on a different level. But that's when Deku would notice that cracks would begin appearing on his hardening ability, and Deku, noticing this, that his steel was getting weaker and weaker, would start trying to rip it off. However, unable to use his arms, he would feel the steel around his neck starting to actually crack, which means that pretty soon it was about to get to his actual skin, which obviously was just as hard, but if he could break his barrier, then he was definitely going to be able to rip his head off of his body. So Deku, in a moment of desperation, would begin trying to actively use his quirk to harden even more than before. And it would be in this moment that Deku would finally gain access to the next evolution of his power, Dragon Force. His scales would grow even harder than before, and his metal would turn to a darker shade of iron, as Deku, turning to the direction of All For One, feeling all this power coursing through him, would simply breathe in, "Big mistake, Iron Dragon, roar!" As he would launch a full-scale attack to the direction of All For One, who, being consumed by this blast of iron breath, would be completely destroyed. In fact, if I could compare it to anything, it would be kind of similar to the moment in which Gohan, using the final Kamehameha wave, would have wiped out Cell. So, with Deku standing there with his 2 classmates injured, he would make his way towards them, as throwing them each over his shoulder, he would take them to the infirmary. He would think, "Damn extras ended up getting hurt. And it was all my fault. I should have protected them." In this moment, he would think, "Some hero," as he would pretty much end up grabbing them and healing them. After this would take place, most of the villains of My Hero Academia have already been handled, so we would end up getting a time skip to Deku graduating from high school about 6 months out of that. With that said, we would get a scene in which Deku inside of a new car would ride up to his old parents' house, as he would end up coming with gifts. He would literally end up telling them to get in the car, as all of them would do so, and in Deku's passenger seat would be Nejire. In this moment, all of Deku's siblings would be like, "Hey Nejire," and she would say, "Hi guys." Since Deku ended up actually marrying her in this timeline, she finally tied the dog down. And safe to say, Deku had changed a lot, maturing a lot over these years and learning that maybe strength wasn't everything. Since Nejire had came into his life, a lot had changed, and a lot for the better. So, with this happening, Deku would end up driving them to their new house, saying that all his life he's only known living with them, and that was only when he took a short break to work as a hero, but now he thinks he's ready to invite them into their new home. So, as everybody would get down, they would walk inside of this massive mansion, with Deku telling them that each one of them was going to be owning a different part of it. Then, grabbing some bags of money, Deku would end up telling them that he made this thanks to the sponsorships that he ended up getting from becoming the number 3 hero. And he would then end up giving them all a ton of money and different stuff. They would all start being super joyful at the stuff that he's given them, as he would end up telling them all that from now on, they were going to be living like royalty. As smiles would appear on Deku's face, and for the first time in Deku's life, his older brother would bring him in for a hug, saying, "Thanks, little bro. Honestly, I never thought I'd be part of the dream, considering I was such a jerk to you as kids." But Deku, looking at his big brother, would say, "What? You kidding? You're the reason I turned out as tough as I am. If anything, I should be thanking you the most." As his older brother would end up pretty much ruffling up his hair, telling him to go out there and be the best hero ever. And one more thing, try not to get killed, Deku. As Izuku, hearing that, would have a smile on his face, looking to Nejire, asking her if they should be off. And so, the duo would leave, as they would continue their pro-hero careers. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where What If Deku had an Iron Quirk, aka the real title, What If Deku was Gajio's reincarnation, is gonna be ending. Let me know down below in the comments what you guys liked about this What If, what you guys didn't like about the video, and what I should do next. Also, PS, if you really want your video to be made, then check out the post tab in my channel and commission it yourself. But with all that out of the way, ladies and gentlemen, it has been your boy Xehther, and I am out. Peace.